You know, nothing's more inviting or more fishy looking than a bunch of green lily pads, but actually producing fish out of these can be kind of tough. Kevin VanDam is going to demonstrate a spinnerbait pattern that works really well this week in depth. Also, bow control, very important in all your fishing situations. Clunn is going to discuss with us rough water bow control that'll help you in our art of angling. First, Quinn is going to give us some spoon techniques for spotted bass in this week's Fishing in 4.
See, look on the screen right now. It's a great shot. See those fish? Those are fish streaking on the screen. Those are feeding fish right there. When they start doing right there, you're pretty susceptible to catching those. We're doing a technique that's probably one of my favorite techniques for fall fishing. Most of the fish are migrating into these creeks, feeding up on this bait. They can kind of sense that winter's around the corner and they need to start feeding up to get fat. And they're just following these big schools of bait in these creeks. They're kind of relating to these outside little points that's right here breaking straight into the creek channel. They're not up on top of anything. They're right where the deepest part of the point is, going right to the creek channel. And right now we're setting about 50 foot of water. There's some bait at about 40, 42 foot, and there's some fish hanging around it. See if we can get this spoon to act like one of those fleeing bait fish. See if we can get a big old bass to run it out. That's a good one. I've seen a couple fish come onto the screen and they was about 10 foot off the bottom. So I immediately dropped that spoon right down, and when I did, those fish come up after that spoon. And when I seen them come up after it, one popped it and missed it, so I immediately just let it free fall, and when I did, that one grabbed it. So they're right here next to the creek channel. And those fish are not moving around a lot. They're kind of stuck there. And that spoon jumping up in their face just acts like a dying bait fish that's just kind of falling right back down into the creek channel. Now this is when good electronics come into play. Like I can watch everything that spoon does and how those fish react to it. Now, if those fish are relating real tight to the bottom, just real small jerks, just small, subtle. You don't want that spoon jumping high. But if those fish are suspended up 5, 6, 8, 10 foot off the bottom, then you want to do a little bit higher jerks, and it'll trigger those fish. We've got cloudy, overcast. I like a white spoon, something that kind of is dull. It just kind of stands out. It shows up a little bit more. The fish can kind of relate to it a lot better. If the sun's out and the fish are keying on predominantly shad, I like a nickel spoon. I run the line through the eye of the spoon, and I tied it directly onto, this right here is a number 4 treble hook. I tied the line directly to that, to where it slides up and down. Those fish will start competing for it. There'll be a school of fish down there trying to get that spoon because it's acting like a dying bait fish. This right here allows that spoon to kind of slide. When that spoon's falling and fluttering, they'll go in on top of that spoon. When they do, they grab that hook and it just kind of pulls away from the spoon. You probably noticed me turning my rod upside down and holding it like that. It takes all the fatigue and everything off your wrist. Instead of when you're holding that thing like that, you're working your wrist up and down, and that plays a toll on you right quick. And also puts a lot more stress on your line. You can actually feel it popping more. If you'll just turn that rod over and hold it like that, you can just kind of just pull up on your wrist. What I'm doing is those fish, like I said, there she is, there's one hit it. That fish followed it down. Fish was sitting about 25 to 30 foot. It actually run up from that school of bait. So I followed it down with a spoon and I watched that fish on electronics. I watched him come after that spoon. Fishing a spoon in these creek channels in the fall of the year for these fish that are migrating in, feeding on the bait, is my number 1 way to catch bass effectively this time of year. And the main thing is it's a lot of fun. There's no other time of the year that you can watch those fish on that screen come up and get that bait.
You know, there's a bunch of ways to fish in lily pads effectively. You can't just go down through there chunking and winding a spinnerbait. Subtle presentations, varying your retrieve angles, and making different variations on your baits can make you more successful. Let's see what Kevin does as we go in depth.
Boy, a big spinnerbait is one of my best offshore structured baits to catch big bass. And that's a quality fish right there. And what I'd like to do is I take a big, 3/4 ounce bait, and I'll cut the wire a little shorter. You can see that wire's cut down about 1/3, and just put a single willow on it. This is a great summertime bait. Let me let this fish go. It's a great summertime bait, and what I'm doing with it is I'm using it as a drop bait. And what happens is the bass will suspend a lot off offshore structure. Now, I love to fish crankbaits and Carolina rigs and things like that, and usually that's how I'll find it. But right now there's a pond dam, an old pond dam across this end of this creek here. And I seen a lot of shad on my depth finder. I cast this bait out there, and you just fire it out there, let it sink down with tension on the line. That way I can feel that blade just turning, and that bait's gonna just helicopter down horizontally, let it sink all the way to the bottom. What I wanna do is I wanna rip it up off the bottom and make it look like a shad that's trying to flee away. So I'm gonna hop it up real hard and follow it back down. Almost like you're setting the hook. And with a 7-foot rod, I'm really making that bait jump way up off the bottom and then flutter back down through those fish. And in the heat of summer, you gotta do something like that to really get these fish to react. One of my favorite ways to catch bass, kind of when they get a little inactive, is just to slow roll a spinnerbait over them. And all it basically means is having that spinnerbait going in a slow, kind of steady retrieve. And a lot of people talk about slow rolling spinnerbaits, but there's a few things that I have to have, or a few key ingredients that I'm looking for when I'm going to slow roll a spinnerbait. First off, I want some type of cover or the bottom that I can have that bait coming over the top of. I don't like to just slow roll a spinnerbait down a flat bank. A tapering grass line that just slowly feeds out off a flat. Standing timber like this, I want to slow roll along the horizontal limbs. And what I like to do is I like that bait to come in contact with that cover. I'm going to have that bait go down. I'm going to reel it just fast enough so I'm just taking the top of whatever it is I'm slow rolling it over. But every time that I come in contact with that cover is when I really want to try to trigger a reaction out of those fish. So as I'm going through and I feel a piece of timber, I'll speed it up and make it crash into that limb and then let it flutter back down. If it's vegetation, it's the same thing. Once I hit the grass, I'm going to snap it out and let it flutter back down. You're constantly just ripping that bait up out of the cover, out of what you're slow rolling it above, and then letting it kind of slowly get back down into it. I want it to hit something anytime I'm slow rolling. You got a nice log like that, it's important to get the boat right so you can get that bait going right down the side of it. And that's when I want to bang it and shake it and try to make it come in contact with it. If I was over here and throwing across it like this, it just, the bait's not in the strike zone very long, and you're just not going to trigger many strikes out of it. You want that bait coming right down any edge that you possibly can. I try to fish as parallel to any cover that I can, or if it's a drop off or a weed line. Anytime you can keep that bait in the strike zone longer, you're going to catch more bass. It gives them more opportunity to bite it, and it's more opportunity to make them mad. The longer it's in the strike zone, the better your chances. Oh man, I just hopped it over a limb there and he just annihilated it. I'll tell you what, it is so important when you're throwing a spinnerbait to make a really good accurate cast with a soft presentation. That's probably the #1 thing that I could tell you to make you a better spinnerbait fisherman, is to learn to be a better caster. And a lot of it is to do with your equipment. When I'm going for pinpoint accuracy and looking for these little lanes in the brush and the bushes and things like that, you need a little shorter rod that has a little shorter handle so you can maneuver it around your body, and it has to have some tip. But what it has to do is it has to flex, with that bait as you go to make your cast. You got to have that nice soft presentation to it. And that gives me that nice, easy, quiet entry when I make that roll cast. And that's the way you have to learn to fish a spinnerbait, is with that underhand cast. That way you can throw it underneath limbs and bushes and things like that. And it's real easy to do. You just leave a little bit of line hanging out like that, and you just loop the bait around. And the key is if that rod is soft enough to follow it around, it helps keep it smooth. So I can take it and just make a nice low presentation. I stop it right at the end and just set the bait in the water real quietly that way, and you're not scaring those fish. If I'm going down the bank like this making that same cast, and it lands with a big splash next to them in shallow water, you're scaring them. They're running away from you. So you got to use that little roll cast, get it out there and get it real tight, and then just set it in there perfect, just like that, without a ripple. Anytime I'm slow rolling it and I want to keep the bait kind of moving horizontally, I'm going to use a tandem, spinnerbait. A tandem willow works real well in the grass. The willows provide a little less lift, and the bait's going to run a little bit deeper. If I want to let the bait drop and fall, though, vertically, like say if I was kind of yo-yoing it or slow rolling around some of this deep timber, I'm going to use a single blade in that situation. Anytime that lure, if I'm going to let it free fall or flutter more than a split second, that's when I'm going to switch over to a single spin. It's really important to keep in contact with the cover that's down there when you're slow rolling, and when you do hit something, try to make that fish react to it. That's where that quick movement, a little snap of the rod or a quick turn of the handle of the reel will trigger that fish into striking if he's close to it. It's a very effective technique.
In a previous Bassmasters Classic, I had some success throwing a topwater frog over these lily pads. This could be another technique that could complement what Kevin is doing.
Spinnerbait is one of my favorite baits for fishing around, isolated pad clumps like this, or reeds, cattails, things like that. Any type of hard grass, it works real well. Now what I try to do is I try to target these clumps and make the spinnerbait kind of run into the stems or the stalks of those pads. So I'll just try to line up 2 or 3 clumps in a row and make a good short accurate cast, and then just bang it off there. Because those bass will be sitting right at the base of those pads or on the root system underneath it. And when that bait bounces off those stems, I can trigger a reaction strike from them. So every time I hit that stem, I'm going to give that rod tip a little bit of a jerk and make that bait kind of jump forward and flare right there. That's what it takes to trigger those bass a lot of times. There he is. Oh God, he come out of there and just annihilated it. I mean, he just lunged out of those pads. Pads hold a lot of bait fish and a lot of shad, and spinnerbait is a great way to find concentrations of them in it because you can cover a lot of water with it. This is where you want to have heavy line on, though. These fish are tough to get out of that. I'm just trying to hit those pad stems with the spinnerbait, and I've got a bait fish color on right now, and with that perfect skirt on there, it just really flares, and that's what I'm trying to do, is hit the pads and make it flare, and that skirt kind of jumps like that, and that's exactly what happened on that one right there. He just annihilated it. It's important to just throw short, accurate casts. The water's got some color in it here. I can slip up close to the fish. I want to be real quiet on the trolling motor. But I'm just going to make a little roll cast and just try to hit all the little pockets and holes, and I can really see the bait well, and I can control it real well, and it keeps me from being fouled up, and I'm just making really accurate pinpoint presentations. 30, 40 feet is all you need to cast when you're fishing around stuff like this. That way you got the best control. There's a good one. Gosh, did he just annihilate it. Come right out of a little pad point, just drilled it. That was awesome right there. You just have to make that bait bounce off those stems, though. You've got to flare that spinnerbait as much as possible to really get them to bite it. I just almost never cast a spinnerbait out and just wind it straight back to the boat. You just don't catch near as many fish as when you're trying to make the fish react to it. It's one of the best lures there is to imitate a bait fish. And what I'm trying to do always is give the bass an idea that there's something wrong with this particular bait fish. Make it look like they can easily catch it. What I'm really doing is just kind of finessing that spinnerbait through there. The pads have got little pockets and holes, and it's just important to kind of keep that bait in the strike zone for as long as possible while you're out there. So I'm just kind of shaking it along, making that skirt kind of flare and pulse, and those blades kind of shudder and shake, kind of bang even together. So I'll use a Colorado willow combination like this right here with a large willow, sometimes even go up to a number 5, or I'll even put an Indiana or a Colorado on the rear to help slow it down, to provide a little more lift. That way I can cast it out there into these little holes and just kind of shake it, and that extra displacement that the Colorado blade gives it helps me slow it down and keep it in the strike zone longer. he was just right on the edge. You know, anytime you can put the percentages in your favor, you know, you want to parallel any type of cover or edge that you can. That just keeps that bait in the strike zone the whole time. If I had my boat positioned out here and I was casting up to the edge of these pads, as soon as it's 2 or 3 foot away from the edge, it's out of the strike zone. This way I'm going right down and I'm making short little pitches. Almost my whole cast every single time is in the strike zone. And as I'm going down through here, each bass that's positioned on that edge is probably going to get a chance to see my bait and strike it 2 or 3 times before the boat goes by. If you can find out what the bass are actually feeding on, even though it might be different or it might conflict a little bit with what your mind tells you for the water clarity and the sky conditions, to use a color pattern that matches the forage the fish are eating. And right now it's shad, and you know, I mean, it's hard to beat in stained water a pearl white or, you know, a white skirt on your bait, because it just really has that same flash as a shad. I really try to watch the forage and look for bait fish around the shoreline, things like that, to really determine what kind of skirt I should have on my bait. If you want to fish some spinnerbaits through lily pads, make sure you got a good stout rod and reel, a good selection of spinnerbaits with the right skirt and blade combination to match the local forage. Try and tick the stems of the pads and fish parallel to the edges so you can keep your bait in the strike zone. You'll find yourself catching lots of bass.
Using your tools properly can help you be more productive on the water. And perhaps the most important tool is your boat. This week, Rick Clunn talks about the importance of boat control in rough water. It's this week's Art of Angling.
You know, often we talk about fishing when we're fishing, but rarely do we talk about boating in fishing. Probably it's the one area I see the most weakness when I look at all my fellow anglers out there, is not just general boating, but really when that occasional day when we all get caught in this storm that we shouldn't be in to begin with. You know, we're fortunate enough to live in a country that has incredible sized lakes. You know, Toledo Bend and Sam Rayburn and Lake Mead and Lake Powell and Lake Champlain and not even to mention the Great Lakes. But the problem with this amount of water is sometimes it can get very, very rough. First of all, you know, obviously use common sense, you know, pay attention to the weather reports. But even I know, I'm an angler, that sometimes we get caught. You know, the tendency is when that pop-up storm comes up and the wind gets high, before you know it, you look across the lake, and 3 miles across the lake is the boat ramp you want to be at. Most of us want to pick a straight line to get there the quickest as we can. And they try to go a little too fast. And that's really not the best thing to do. That's what gets you in trouble. First of all, you don't want to go in a straight line in real rough water. You want to have more of a zigzag motion. You never really want your bow to hit directly into the wave. You always want to be at angles. The other thing is that you don't have to hit all the big ones. If any of you guys out there that have surfed before, you realize that waves come in sets. You might have a big set of waves coming over here, and then you have a smaller set over here. And that's where that zigzag motion and those angles help you. You really want to try to avoid those big sets. You want to give yourself plenty of time to get back. Instead of looking across the lake, take one wave at a time. That's what's helped me most in navigating rough water in my career. Know your equipment. Today's equipment is very capable of handling rough water. I'll even stop the boat and just let it bob up and down in these big waves, even out on lakes like Lake Ontario. And all of a sudden, it kind of gives people a little bit more confidence in their boat and the boat they're riding in. And that's important because that takes away some of that fear that can get you in trouble. Also, store your equipment in the boat. Put it away. You know, rods, reels, even take off your depth finders if the water's real bad, put it away. The last thing you want to be worried about, and where I see most people get hurt, is when they're trying to capture a tackle box that's fixing to go out of the boat, and they grab for it and the wave knocks them down in the bottom of the boat. Again, more important than anything is common sense and awareness of the weather. Really try to pay attention to that, but I know we all get caught. So when we do, just show some patience.